Good evening. Tonight's story is Murtough and the Witch Woman from the Irish Fairy Book by Alfred Percival Graves. First published in 1909, this book is a collection of Irish myths and legends documented by different writers and folklorists. This specific story was written by Eleanor Hull, a journalist and scholar of the Old Irish language. Although this is a fairy story, it is a dark and disquieting tale. It deals with lust and vengeance, magic and tragedy. It is, literally and metaphorically, about the conflict between pagan and Christian beliefs in 6th century Ireland. Although I will try my very best, I am about to dreadfully mispronounce some Irish proper nouns. I would welcome any help and suggestions in the comments below. And now, let's open our imaginations and begin. In the days when Murtough MacAircha was in the High Kingship of Ireland, the country was divided between the old beliefs of paganism and the new doctrines of the Christian teaching. Part held with the old creed and part with the new, and the thought of the people was troubled between them, for they knew not which way to follow and which to forsake. The faith of their forefathers hung close around them, holding them by many fine and tender threads of memory and custom and tradition. Yet still the new faith was making its way, and every day it spread wider and wider through the land. The family of Murtough had joined itself to the Christian faith, and his 3 brothers were bishops and abbots of the church. But Murtough himself remained a pagan, for he was a wild and lawless prince, and the peaceful teachings of the Christian doctrine, with its forgiveness of enemies, pleased him not at all. Fierce and cruel was his life, filled with dark deeds and bloody wars, and savage and tragic was his death, as we shall hear. Now Murtough was in the sunny summer palace of Cletty, which Cormac, son of Art, had built for a pleasure house on the brink of the slow-flowing Boyne, near the fairy brook of Angus the ever-young, the god of youth and beauty. A day of summer was that day, and the king came forth to hunt on the borders of the brook, with all his boon companions around him. But when the high noon came, the sun grew hot, and the king sat down to rest upon the fairy mound, and the hunt passed on behind him, and he was left alone. There was a witch woman in that country, whose name was Sigh, Sough, Storm, Rough Wind, Winter Night, Cry, Wail, and Groan. Star-bright and beautiful was she in face and form, but inwardly she was as cruel as her names. And she hated Murtough, because he had scattered and destroyed the ancient peoples of the fairy tribes of Erin, her country and her fatherland. And because in the battle which he fought at Serb on the Boyne, her father and her mother and her sister had been slain, for in those days women went to battle side by side with men. She knew, too, that with the coming of the new faith, trouble would come upon the fairy folk, and their power and their great majesty would depart from them, and men would call them demons, and would drive them out with psalm-singing, and with the saying of prayers, and with the sound of little tinkling bells. So trouble and anger wrought in the witch woman, and she waited the day to be revenged on Murtough, for he being yet a pagan, was still within her power to harm. So when Sheen, for Sheen or Storm was the name men gave to her, saw the king seated on the fairy mound and all his comrades parted from him, she arose softly and combed her hair with her comb of silver adorned with little ribs of gold. And she washed her hands in a silver basin wherein were 4 golden birds sitting on the rim of the bowl, and little bright gems of carbuncle set round about the rim. And she donned her fairy mantle of flowing green, and her cloak wide and hooded with silvery fringes, and a brooch of fairest gold. On her head were tresses yellow like to gold, plaited in 4 locks, with a golden drop at the end of each long tress. The hue of her hair was like the flower of the iris in summer, or like red gold after the burnishing thereof. And she wore on her breasts and at her shoulders marvelous clasps of gold, finely worked with the tracery of the skilled craftsman, and a golden twisted torque around her throat. And when she was decked, she went softly and sat down beside Murtough on the turfy hunting mound. And after a space Murtough perceived her sitting there, and the sun shining upon her, so that the glittering of the golden of her golden hair and the bright shining of the green silk of her garments was like the yellow iris beds upon the lake on a sunny summer's day. Wonder and terror seized on Murtough at her beauty, and he knew not if he loved her or if he hated her the most, for at one moment all his nature was filled with longing and with love of her, so that it seemed to him that he would give the whole of Ireland for the loan of 1 hour's space of dalliance with her. But after that he felt a dread of her, because he knew his fate was in her hands and that she had come to work him ill. But he welcomed her as if she were known to him, and he asked her wherefore she was come. "I am come," she said, "because I am beloved of Murtough, son of Eire, king of Erin, and I come to seek him here." Then Murtough was glad, and he said, "Dost thou not know me, maiden?" "I do," she answered, "for all secret and mysterious things are known to me, and thou and all the men of Erin are well known." After he had conversed with her a while, she appeared to him so fair that the king was ready to promise her anything in life she wished, so long as she would go with him to Cletty of the Boyne. "My wish," she said, "is that you take me to your house, and that you put out from it your wife and your children, because they are of the new faith, and all the clerics that are in your house, and that neither your wife nor any cleric be permitted to enter the house while I am there." "I will give you," said the king, 100 head of every herd of cattle that is within my kingdom, and 100 drinking horns, and 100 cups, and 100 rings of gold, and a feast every other night in the summer palace of Cletty. But I pledge thee my word, O maiden, it were easier for me to give thee half of Ireland than to do this thing that thou hast asked. For Murtough feared that when those that were of the Christian faith were put out of his house, she would work her spells upon him, and no power would be left with him to resist those spells. "I will not take thy gifts," said the damsel, "but only those things that I have asked. Moreover, it is thus that my name must never be uttered by thee, nor must any man or woman learn it." "What is thy name?" said Murtough, "that it may not come upon my lips to utter it?" And she said, "Sigh, sough, storm, rough wind, winter night, cry, wail, groan, this is my name. But men call me Sheen, for Storm or Sheen is my chief name, and storms are with me where I come." Nevertheless, Murtough was so fascinated by her that he brought her to his home, and he drove out the clerics that were there, with his wife and children along with them, and drove out also the nobles of his own clan, the children of Niall, 2 great and gallant battalions. And Ducha, his wife, went crying along the road with her children around her to seek Bishop Carnock, the half-brother of her husband, and her own soul friend, that she might obtain help and shelter from him. But Sheen went gladly and light-heartedly into the house of Cletty, and when she saw the lovely lightsome house and the goodly nobles of the clan of Niall, and the feasting and banqueting and the playing of the minstrels, and all the joyous noise of that kingly dwelling, her heart was lifted within her, and "Fair as a fairy palace is this house of Cletty," said she. "Fair indeed it is," replied the king, "for neither the kings of Leinster nor the kings of mighty Ulster, or the lords of the clans of Owen or of Niall have such a house as this. Nay, in Tara of the kings itself, no house to equal this house of mine is found." And that night the king robed himself in all the splendor of his royal dignity, and on his right hand he seated Sheen, and a great banquet was made before them, and men said that never on earth was to be seen a woman more goodly of appearance than she. And the king was astonished at her, and began to ask her questions, for it seemed to him that the power of a great goddess of the ancient time was in her, and he asked her whence she came, and what manner was the power that he saw in her. He asked her, too, did she believe in the god of the clerics, or was she herself some goddess of the older world, for he feared her, feeling that his fate was in her hands. She laughed a careless and a cruel laugh, for she knew that the king was in her power, now that she was there alone with him, and the clerics and the Christian teachers gone. "Fear me not, O Murtough," she cried. "I am, like thee, a daughter of the race of men and of the ancient family of Adam and Eve, fit and meet my comradeship with thee, therefore fear not nor regret. And as to that true God of thine, worker of miracles and helper of his people, no miracle in all the world is there that I, by mine own unaided power, cannot work the like. I can create a sun and moon, the heavens I can sprinkle with the radiant stars of night. I can call up to life men fiercely fighting in conflict, slaughtering one another. Wine I could make of the cold water of the Boyne, and sheep of lifeless stones, and swine of ferns. In the presence of the hosts I can make gold and silver, plenty and to spare, and hosts of famous fighting men I can produce from naught. Now tell me, can thy God work the like? Work for us, says the king, some of these great wonders. Then Sheen went forth out of the house, and she set herself to work spells on Murtough, so that he knew not whether he was in his right mind or no. She took of the water of the Boyne and made a magic wine thereout, and she took ferns and spiked thistles and light puff balls of the woods, and out of them she fashioned magic swine and sheep and goats, and with these she fed Murtough and the hosts. And when they had eaten, all their strength went from them, and the magic wine sent them into an uneasy sleep and restless slumbers. And out of the stones and sods of earth she fashioned 3 battalions, and one of the battalions she placed at one side of the house, and the other at the further side beyond it, and one encircling the rest southward along the hollow windings of the glen. And thus were these battalions, one of them all made of men stark naked and their colour blue, and the second with heads of goats with shaggy beards and horned, but the third more terrible than they, for these were headless men, fighting like human beings, yet finished at the neck. And the sound of heavy shouting, as of hosts and multitudes, came from the first and the second battalion, but from the third no sound, save only that they waved their arms and struck their weapons together, and smote the ground with their feet impatiently. And though terrible was the shout of the blue men and the bleating of the goats with human heads, more horrible yet was the stamping and the rage of those headless men finished at the neck. And Murtough, in his sleep and in his dreams, heard the battle shout, and he rose impetuously from off his bed, but the wine overcame him, and his strength departed from him, and he fell helplessly upon the floor. Then he heard the challenge a second time, and the stamping of the feet without, and he rose again, and madly, fiercely he set on them, charging the hosts and scattering them before him, as he thought, as far as the fairy palace of the Brugh. But all his strength was lost in fighting phantoms, for they were but stones and sods and withered leaves of the forest that he took for fighting. Now Ducha, Murtaugh's wife, knew what was going on. She called upon Carnoch to arise and to gather together the clans of the children of his people, the men of Owen and of Niall, and together they went to the fort, but Sheen guarded it well, so they could by no means find an entrance. Then Carnoch was angry, and he cursed the place, and he dug a grave before the door, and he stood upon the mound of the grave, and rang his bells, and cursed the king and his house, and prophesied his downfall. But he blessed the clans of Owen and of Niall, and they returned to their own country. Then Carnoch sent messengers to seek Murtough and to draw him away from the witch woman who sought his destruction. But because she was so lovely, the king would believe no evil of her, and whenever he made any sign to go to Carnoch, she threw her spell upon the king so that he could not break away. When he was so weak and faint that he had no power left, she cast a sleep upon him, and she went round the house, putting everything in readiness. She called upon her magic host of warriors and set them round the fortress with their spears and javelins pointed inward toward the house, so that the king would not dare to go out amongst them. And that night was a night of Samhain, the eve of Wednesday after All Souls' Day. Then she went everywhere throughout the house and took lighted brands and burning torches and scattered them in every part of the dwelling. And she returned into the room wherein Murtough slept and lay down by his side. And she caused a great wind to spring up, and it came soughing through the house from northwest, and the king said, "This is the sigh of the winter night." And Sheen smiled because, unwittingly, the king had spoken her name, for she knew that by that the hour of her revenge had come. "'Tis I myself that am sigh in winter night," she said, And I am rough wind and storm, a daughter of fair nobles, and I am cry and wail, the maid of elfin birth who brings ill luck to men. And after that she caused a great snowstorm to come around the house, and like the noise of troops and the rage of battle was the storm beating and pouring in on every side, so that drifts of deep snow were piled against the walls, blocking the doors and chilling the folk that were feasting within the house. But the king was lying in a heavy, unresting sleep, and Sheen was at his side. Suddenly he screamed out of his sleep and stirred himself, for he heard the crash of falling timbers and the noise of the magic hosts, and he smelled the strong smell of fire in the palace. He sprang up. "It seems to me," he cried, "that hosts of demons are about the house, and they are slaughtering my people, and that the house of Cletty is on fire." "It was but a dream," the witch maiden said. Then he slept again, and he saw a vision, to wit, that he was tossing in a ship at sea, and the ship floundered, and above his head a griffin, with a sharp beak and talons, sailed, her wings outspread and covering all the sun, so that it was dark as middle night. And lo, as she rose on high, her plumes quivered for a moment in the air, then down she swooped and picked him up from the waves, carrying him to her eyrie on the dismal cliff overhanging the ocean. And the griffin began to pierce him and to prod him with her talons and to pick out pieces of his flesh with her beak. And this went on a while, and then a flame that came he knew not whence rose from the nest, and he and the griffin were enveloped in the flame. Then in her beak the griffin picked him up, and together they fell downward over the cliff's edge into the seething ocean, so that, half by fire and half by water, he died a miserable death. When the king saw that vision, he rose screaming from his sleep and donned his arms, and he made one plunge forward, seeking for the magic hosts, but he found no man to answer him. The damsel went forth from the house, and Murtough made to follow her, but as he turned, the flames leapt out, and all between him and the door was one vast sheet of flame. He saw no way of escape save the vat of wine that stood in the banqueting hall, and into that he got, but the burning timbers of the roof fell upon his head, and the hails of fiery sparks rained on him, so that half of him was burned and half was drowned, as he had seen in his dream. The next day, amid the embers, the clerics found his corpse, and they took it up and washed it in the Boyne, and carried it to Tulane to bury it. And they said, "Alas, that Mac Airca, high king of Erin, of the noble race of Conn and the descendants of Ugain the Great, should die fighting with swords and stones. Alas, that the cross of Christ was not signed upon his face, that he might have known the witchdoms of the maiden for what they were." And as they went thus, bewailing the death of Murtough and bearing him to his grave, Dúcha, wife of Murtough, met them, and when she found her husband dead, she struck her hands together, and she made a great and mournful lamentation. And because weakness came upon her, she leaned her back against the ancient tree that is in Annachreal, and a burst of blood broke from her heart, and there she died, grieving for her husband. And the grave of Murtough was made wide and deep, and there they laid the queen beside him, two in the one grave, near the north side of the little church that is in Tulane. Now when the burial was finished, and the clerks were reciting over his grave the deeds of the king, and were making prayers for Murtaugh's soul, that it might be brought out of hell, for Carnoch showed great care for this, they saw coming towards them across the sward a lonely woman, star-bright and beautiful, and a kirtle of priceless silk upon her, and a green mantle with its fringes of silver thread flowing to the ground. She reached the place where the clerics were, and saluted them, and they saluted her, and they marveled at her beauty, but they perceived upon her an appearance of sadness and of heavy grief. They asked of her, "Who art thou, maiden, and wherefore art thou come to this house of mourning? For a king lies buried here." "A king lies buried here indeed," said she, "and it was I who slew him. Murtough of the many deeds, of the race of Conn and Niall, high king of Ireland and of the West. And though it was I who wrought his death, I myself will die for grief of him." And they said, "Tell us, maiden, why you brought him to his death, if so be that he was dear to thee." And she said, "Murtough was dear to me indeed, dearest of the men of the whole world. For I am Sheen, the daughter of Saij, the son of Dian, from whom Ath Siji, or the Ford of Siege, is called today. But Murtough slew my father, and my mother and sister were slain along with him in the battle of Surb upon the Boyne, and there was none of my house to avenge their death, save myself alone. Moreover, in his time, the ancient peoples of the fairy tribes of Erin were scattered and destroyed, the folk of the underworld and of my fatherland, and to avenge the wrong and the loss he wrought on them, I slew the man I loved. I made poison for him. Alas, I made for him magic drink and food which took his strength away, and out of the sods of earth and puffballs that float upon the wind, I wrought men and armies of headless, hideous folk, till all his senses were distraught. And now, take me to thee, O Carnach, in fervent and true repentance, and sign the cross of Christ upon my brow, for the time of my death is come. Then she made penitence for the sin that she had sinned, and she died there upon the grave of grief and of sorrow after the king. And they digged a grave lengthwise across the foot of the wide grave of Murtough and his spouse, and there they laid the maiden who had wrought them woe. And the clerics wondered at these things, and they wrote them and revised them in a book. This story is incredibly complex and powerful, and magic and legend and fact and history are just inextricably intermingled in nearly every sentence. Murtough actually was a High King of Ireland in the 6th century, but the facts of his life and death have actually been so entangled and embellished with myths over the centuries that we don't know much about his actual biography. This story is also laden with references to deeply significant places and details in Irish mythology. It begins at the Brooch of the Boyne, one of the most supernaturally and historically significant parts of Ireland, and it moves through places laden with legend and myth and history. Murtaugh's threefold death is yet another legendary theme. It's very common in pagan mythology, along with the elements like the power of real names and the tinkling of bells. Sheen is a complex, detailed character with a really compelling backstory, and of course she makes great speeches. I love that. There is so much going on here, and this is just one of hundreds of myths and legends that take place in the Boyne River Valley. It is well worth reading this version of the story, which I will link in the description below. The book itself is actually very beautiful, and comparing with other versions of the death of Murtough and other kings and heroes of Ireland. The writer or the documenter of this story, Eleanor Hull, was born in England, but her father was Irish, and she took up studies of Gaelic language and Irish folklore in her early 30s. She went on to sit on the council of the Folklore Society, become president of the Irish Literary Society, and to co-found the Irish Text Society. Although the bulk of her work actually was scholarly, she is best remembered today for her popularizations of Irish literature and mythology. At Restored Lore, I have the pleasure of finding these wonderful old stories and bringing them to you every week. If you like obscure and odd folklore, then subscribe and choose notifications so that you never miss a story.